Hello, this is Quentin Carton from ServiceNow. In this demo video, I want to show you how your internal developers can leverage Boomi Cloud API management to interact with ServiceNow, so you don't have access to give them access to table API or flow API trigger. You can have them go through Boomi and add an additional layer of security and control, and you will get more visibility into what API are used, and you can use the same process for any platform that for which your developers need access to, right? So this is a very simple example, but this will work for giving table API access via Boomi, or giving ServiceNow API, flow trigger access to your developer without giving them access directly to the ServiceNow instance. They will use Boomi as a API gateway if you wish. So let's go to one of the example on my ServiceNow instance. This is a simple ServiceNow workflow that perform a bunch of tasks. But that workflow uses an API trigger. So when you do this in ServiceNow, then you can have your internal developer making API queries using that API endpoint, which is going to be using your instance URL and that API path. And then using that, they can trigger ServiceNow workflow and even get the output of the workflow. So that's the example I'm going to be using. In that example, I may have hundreds of flow designer flows that use API trigger, and I want to provide better visibility into who is gonna be using that, that API endpoint, and maybe put additional layer of security. In my example, I don't want to give them access to ServiceNow credential at all to my developer. I want to give them a specific API key for a certain period of time. And I can do this using Boomi. The same way I will use Boomi to give access to another platform and provide a specific set of keys to those people. So how does that work? So first of all, let me show you, if I don't use Boomi, and I'm using, let's say, Postman to go directly to that flow API trigger here. I'm just making an API call to ServiceNow. This is returning an execution ID of my workflow. That workflow, if I go in the operation tab and refresh, you'll see an entry here, right? The workflow get executed. Let's say I'm a developer. I've been using the ServiceNow API directly to trigger that workflow, but I had to use some ServiceNow credentials, and that's probably something I don't want to do. I don't want to give to my developer because it's usually managed by a different team, those API access, right? So I don't want to do anything with the ServiceNow team, for example. So let's see how in Boomi I configure a new API definition for this, and so I can give access to a Boomi URL or endpoint to my developer that they can use to interact with ServiceNow. So I've been to Boomi Cloud API Management, and I created a new endpoint called ServiceNow Flow that I'm going to be opening. And then in the domains and traffic routing, this is where the magic happened, where I'm using my Boomi public URL that was given to me by Boomi. And here I've created a specific path, like /flow. When I'm going to be talking to the developer, I'm going to give them access to that path. They only need to worry about that URL, that Boomi URL /flow. But underneath the cover, because I'm applying this configuration in Boomi, I'm redirecting the API call they're going to make to Boomi will be routed to my actual endpoint, which is my ServiceNow instance, and that particular API path that corresponds to the flow designer. And I'm showing you everything so it's easy for you to understand the flow designer API path that I have here. But this, they won't need to know that, because I'm just going to give them access to that API endpoint in Boomi and that /flow, which is the path. For the authentication for the developers, I'm going to give them keys. So in In Boomi, you can create package keys and plan and configure how you want to distribute and give keys to API keys to the developers. So when they authenticate, they use the authentication method within Boomi. You don't have to worry about them getting access to ServiceNow at all. But for the here for my ServiceNow API to work, I need to authenticate to the ServiceNow ServiceNow credentials. So I'm configuring here my ServiceNow account. It could be a ServiceNow service account or a specific user dedicated for that flow trigger with specific permission. So that's the credentials I'm putting here needs to have the right permission to execute or make the query in ServiceNow, right? So here my account Quentin Carton have access to that flow trigger and has a permission to execute a flow. All right, so you need to worry about this. From a developer, I'm not giving them access to those credentials. I'm giving them access to a key that I configured in my API, my package keys. Here, I configured a specific package key here for this. Well, you're gonna see the key, but I will change it anyway. But that particular key will be given to the developer, and he will use that key to authenticate to the Boomi endpoint. And let's see how that works. So now we've seen with Postman how I execute the flow using the flow trigger without Boomi. Now that I've configured this in Boomi, I'm gonna use in Postman, I already pre-configured here that API call in Postman. So you can see this is the URL of my Boomi platform here and the path. There's nothing to do here with ServiceNow, and I'm authenticating with that key that I got for my Boomi administrator. I'm not authenticating with ServiceNow credential at all, but I can still click send and get a response back from ServiceNow because the API query gets ready to ServiceNow, and in my API definition, I've configured the proper credentials to be able to trigger that workflow. So that's the response from my ServiceNow instance. If I go here and I go in the operation tab, you'll see refresh, and now you see a new entry. I was able to trigger a workflow via Boomi. So this gives you this helps you centralize every single API call that you may make to ServiceNow and have some kind of additional layer on top of the ServiceNow API. And behind this with Boomi, I won't show this in the demo, but there's a lot of reporting, auditing, tracking, and quota that you can apply on how much call a given developer can make to ServiceNow, how many calls per second and things like that. And those are the control natively that you cannot do with ServiceNow without Boomi. So that's kind of the additional value you get on using Boomi for those API calls. So I hope that was helpful. I just want to show what can be done using Boomi and the ServiceNow API.